In 1960, two men made a bet. There was only $50 on the line, but millions of people would experience the impact of this little wager. The first man bet the second that he would not be able to write an entertaining children's book using only 50 different words. The second man took the bet, and the result? We'll see if this sounds familiar. I do not like green eggs and ham. I do not like them, Sam I am. I will not eat them in a house. I will not eat them with a mouse. I will not eat them in a box. I will not eat them with a fox. I do not like green eggs and ham. I do not like them, Sam I am. Of course, this is the classic children's book, Green Eggs and Ham, written by the iconic Dr. Seuss. The book became his best-selling work, selling over 8 million copies. No doubt Dr. Seuss was a talented author and artist, but what he discovered through this little bet was the power of setting constraints. Once you know your constraints, you can creatively figure out how to work within them. A lot of authors would complain about being limited to 50 words, but Dr. Seuss decided to embrace the challenge and created a work of art. This is an example of what we might call the paradox of limits. You see, a lot of people think freedom is being able to do whatever you want. Many of us think that the fewer boundaries we have on our choices and actions, the freer we will be. But that's just not true. Jesus, in all of his brilliance, understood this paradox of limits. It's why he taught his disciples that the way to truly experience freedom was to embrace the limits of his commands. We're in week 2 of our series, Are You a Disciple?, where we're challenging one another to a season of self-reflection during which we examine our own lives for evidence that we're following Jesus. In the Gospels, Jesus says that there are particular ways of being in this world that characterize his disciples. If these ways are evident in our lives, then we are truly following him. So during this series, we're digging into 4 of Jesus' sayings, opening ourselves to his leadership and teaching. And today, we're going to wrestle with this statement. Jesus said, "If you hold to my teaching, you are really my disciples." In essence, Jesus is saying that his disciples can be identified by their obedience to his commands. If you are a disciple of Jesus, you hold to his teaching. You embrace the limits of his commands. So that's it. All you have to do to be a disciple is to obey the teachings of Jesus. Simple, right? Well, there's a problem. I feel it, and my hunch is you feel it too. Obedience doesn't come naturally. Obedience that is forced doesn't work. Have you ever watched a parent tell their kid, "Just do what I say"? It doesn't work. Or have you ever watched a boss tell their employee, "Just hit your numbers this quarter, just do it"? It doesn't work. I think many of us, especially if you grew up in a religious household, have heard some version of Jesus that makes him sound like a frustrated parent or a disgruntled boss. In my 3 decades of being a pastor, I've had so many conversations with people who know they've messed up and assume God is angry or frustrated with them for not measuring up. Maybe you walk around worried that at any moment God might drop the hammer on you for not obeying. But here's what I want to tell you today. Forced obedience isn't what Jesus is asking for. That's not what Jesus is inviting you into today. So what is he inviting you into? Today we're going to look at 2 passages that answer that question, starting with today's key verse. When Jesus said, "If you hold to my teaching, you are really my disciples," he follows that up with this statement, "Then you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free." Jesus says obedience is necessary because we are not currently experiencing freedom. Obedience is an invitation to freedom. Now, the Jewish audience Jesus originally spoke these words to were offended by the suggestion that they were not free. Maybe some of us are offended too. They answered him, "We are Abraham's descendants and have never been slaves of anyone. How can you say that we shall be set free?" Perhaps we, like Jesus' first audience, don't like the implication that we're enslaved. We might have responded to Jesus, "Hey, I have the power to make my own choices and live life as I see fit. I have a good job and financial freedom. I live in a free country and enjoy individual liberties. I am not a slave that needs to be freed." But I suspect that Jesus would respond to us the same way he responded to his original audience. Jesus replied, "Very truly, I tell you, everyone who sins is a slave to sin. Now, a slave has no permanent place in the family, but a son belongs to it forever. So if the Son sets you free, you will be free indeed." You see, it's our sin, the choices we make, the actions we take that don't align with the teachings of Jesus that end up enslaving us. We may think we're free, but we're actually in bondage. Spending. It can feel like freedom until you're enslaved by debt. Drinking can feel like freedom until you're enslaved by addiction. Giving someone a piece of your mind can feel like freedom until you're enslaved by regret. In a popular TED Talk, psychologist Barry Schwartz pointed out that many of us believe that the way to maximize happiness is by maximizing your individual freedom. And the way to maximize freedom is to maximize choice. We think freedom means the ability to do whatever you want. But then Schwartz pointed to a picture of a fish in a fishbowl and pointed out, if you shatter the fishbowl so that everything is possible, you don't have freedom, you have disaster. Everybody needs a fishbowl. The absence of a metaphorical fishbowl is a recipe for misery and disaster. The teachings and commands of Jesus are an invitation to freedom. They are the limits that enable us to thrive. For example, Jesus says, when you are wronged, don't retaliate, but turn the other cheek. You see, his teaching is a limit that becomes a freedom. Instead of being consumed by anger and a desire for revenge, we can experience the freedom of forgiveness. Jesus says, don't give yourself over to lust. His teaching is a limit that becomes a freedom. Instead of being enslaved by an addiction to pornography, we can experience the freedom to love. Jesus says, do not judge. His teaching is a limit that becomes a freedom. Instead of being imprisoned by the desire to condemn, we can experience the freedom of grace. What disciples of Jesus come to realize is that the constraints of his commands aren't there to force us into good behavior, but to set us free. Obedience is an invitation to freedom. The Son wants to set us free. And it's also an invitation to relationship. A little later in the Gospel of John, Jesus is sharing a meal with his disciples, actually his last meal before his crucifixion, when he says, "If you love me, keep my commands." Okay, this is really, really important. You see, at one point or another, I think most of us have fallen into the trap of thinking God is just some all-powerful being wanting us to obey simply because, I don't know, maybe God just wants to feel better about being God. We can look at his call to obey as some kind of power trip. After all, put these words of Jesus into the mouth of an ordinary human being, and we'd be concerned that the person was being manipulative or even abusive. But obviously, that's not God at all. Keep in mind, when Jesus makes this statement, he is on his way to the cross. He is preparing for his own death. He's about to empty himself of his power and offer himself as a sacrifice. And in this crucial moment, he says to his disciples, "If you love me, keep my commands." Now, I think it's helpful to point out, as scholar Frederick Dale Bruner does, that our English translations have a bit of a rough slant here. This verse is often translated, "if you love me," if. But Bruner points out that the word translated "if" is quite dynamic and could just as easily, maybe even more correctly, be translated "when." When you love me, keep my commands. I think this "when" instead of "if" is Jesus reminding us that this obedience thing is all about relationship. As Jesus is preparing to go to the cross, he turns to his disciples, the one he has spent 3 years with and dearly loves, and he says, "When you love me, you will keep my commands." Obedience is an invitation to relationship. Doesn't this make sense of the deepest relationships you've experienced in your life? Think about it related to marriage. You don't stay faithful to someone because they tell you to be faithful. You are faithful to someone because you love them. But if you're not in a relationship with someone, you probably won't obey. For example, when you're on an airplane, how many of you have ignored the command to pay attention to the flight attendant for safety instructions? I mean, I have. When you're walking in a city, how many of you have ignored the do not walk sign and crossed the street when there were no cars coming? I have. I mean, most of us aren't motivated to obey when there is no relationship. But as Jesus is preparing for the cross, he looks into the faces of the men and women he dearly loves and reminds them that their obedience to his commands will reveal the love they have for him. In fact, as we continue in this passage, Jesus says to these disciples, "I will not leave you. I will not leave you as orphans. I will come to you." Now, what's going on here? Well, I suspect that Jesus knows one of the great challenges his disciples then and his disciples now are going to face is that when life gets hard, we start doubting the relationship. When your job falls apart, you begin to wonder, where is God and whether he will meet your needs? When your relationships start to feel strained, you might question how God could let this happen and why he isn't fixing it. When your spiritual health or your mental health begins to dip, you can find yourself surrounded by doubts and questioning whether God is really there and whether he truly cares. You see, when life gets hard, we might be tempted to wonder, did God abandon me? Am I really just an orphan? I've always been so struck by the image of an orphan. Everyone is meant to have parents they can rely upon, but sometimes when life is cruel, children are left without parents to care for them. One of the classic stories you might remember from high school literature about an orphan is Oliver Twist by Charles Dickens. In this story, Oliver, an orphan who is abandoned to the workhouses of industrial London, finds himself vulnerable and just looking for a place to belong. And this is when the character Fagin enters the scene. Now, Fagin is a manipulative bully who recruits orphan children into his gang in order to trick them into pickpocketing valuables for him. So what does Oliver do? Well, in his bid to belong, Oliver falls in with Fagin's gang and ends up getting arrested for stealing. And I can't help but think that many of us have more of a connection to Oliver than we'd like to admit. There can be an orphan spirit that settles into our hearts when the pressures of life begin to grow intense and we start looking for anyone and anything that can offer us any sense of safety, security, or control. Orphans long for belonging, and like Oliver, we can offer our allegiance to whomever or whatever will take us, even if that allegiance has no interest in our overall well-being. But Jesus says, "You belong with me. I will not leave you as orphans. You can trust me. Give your allegiance to me." Our obedience becomes a mark of that allegiance. It demonstrates that we do, in fact, belong to God. Jesus goes on to say, "Whoever has my commands and keeps them is the one who loves me. The one who loves me will be loved by my Father, and I too will love them and show myself to them." Obedience is an invitation to relationship. It's a mark of our allegiance to Jesus. It is an opportunity to express our love to the one who was willing to go to the cross so that we could belong to the family of God. When you realize that Jesus' call to obedience is actually an invitation to freedom and relationship, obedience becomes a privilege and a blessing. It's the paradox of limits. Obedience isn't something forced on us. It is something Jesus invites us into. And as we grow in our relationship with Jesus, we can grow in obedience to his teachings. Perhaps this wisdom from a wise Christian saint known as Therese of Lisieux might be helpful. Therese was pondering and praying about how overwhelming it was to try and keep all of Jesus' teachings, and said she felt like every time she pictured this life of obedience, it felt like a staircase that she simply could not climb. And that was when the Holy Spirit gently whispered to her, the voice of Jesus saying, "Therese, it's not a staircase, it's an elevator. You can't climb all these steps on your own, but when you lean into love, trusting the work of God in you, that's when God begins to lift you higher and higher up." Well, this led to Therese practicing what has become known as Therese's little way. This little way consisted of simple, everyday acts of love, humility, and self-surrender as Therese sought to grow in her relationship with God. And these small steps of obedience led Therese and countless disciples of Jesus who have followed her wisdom to what we are all really longing for: a relationship with God that feels free and close. You can take those small steps towards God too. This paradoxical way of life where obedience is the way to freedom and relationship is actually what the U plus life is all about. Remember, you can choose to live a life centered on, well, you. The you life is a life often driven by your own desires and long-held ways of thinking. It can be characterized by the pursuit of power, wealth, comfort, or prestige. Many times it's a disconnected life where your true self remains hidden from God, from others, and maybe even from you. What Jesus invites us to is what we've been calling the you plus life. It's a life that isn't centered on you, but on three life-giving connections: you plus God, you and the church, and you and the world. Your connection with God is the foundation of a U plus life, and allegiance to Jesus is at the core of that connection. As we start this new year together, we are challenging one another to look at this coming year as an opportunity to grow in the U plus life. And specifically today, I want to challenge you to be honest with yourself about your connection to God and specifically your allegiance to Jesus. When you step back and look honestly at your life, do you see a disciple who holds to Jesus's teaching? Now, I'm not asking that question in order to put a guilt trip on myself or any of you, but as an invitation to recognize that Jesus loves you and he wants to set you free. His way is the way to true freedom. In what area of your life is Jesus calling you to trust him and obey? Of course, a key component of the U plus life is that it is a life that is not meant to be lived alone. We need each other to grow in this life. And that's why we are encouraging you as we start this new year to take the intentional step of having a U plus discipleship conversation. This is a conversation you can have with a friend in your small group, a family member, a mentor. If you aren't sure who you could have this conversation with, reach out and we'll help connect you with someone. The purpose of this conversation is simply to help you discern how God is speaking to you and what next steps He is calling you to take in your U+ journey. The start of a new year is a great time to have this conversation. So all through this month, we're going to encourage you to take this step. Scan the QR code on the screen to learn more and get started. Friends, Jesus wants you to be free. The you life, a life lived on your own with no limits, is actually a smash the fishbowl kind of life. You think the absence of constraints is freedom, but it's actually misery, disaster, and ultimately death. The U+ life is a life within the loving limits that Jesus has given us. It's the way to freedom. It's the way to an ever-deepening relationship with God. So let's follow Jesus and hold to His teachings. He is the way, the truth, and the life.